Welcome, everyone. Thanks so much for coming today. I know this was probably already covered, but please feel free to put your name and pronouns in the chat and any organizational affiliations that you might have, who you're with, kind of where you heard about this event. I'd like to know where you're from, if you're from Texas or maybe somewhere else around the country, and what is the closest body of water if you want to play along with this sort of like water icebreaker. What's the nearest body of water to you? And or what do you love about like your favorite body of water, a body of, that. So we're just making a little water connection. So some of the like housekeeping logistics or that we would love to see you on video. I think like today is more of a conversation style, so it might be good to see who's in the room. So feel free, if you're comfortable, to go stay on video, but just mute yourself when not speaking. And we will, I think, be able to take questions kind of maybe throughout. So if you have a question, you can raise your hand or you can put it in the chat. But I think probably we're gonna maybe keep questions to the end. There's definitely going to be time for that at the end. So I'll let Becky and Lynn, when they kind of like get to their part, determine, how that's going to work. But these are sort of like the groundkeeping logistics there and the icebreaker. I haven't done mine yet, but I will here in a minute. Let's see if I can go to the next one. But I just wanted to talk about Commission Shift. So I'm Paige Powell, Policy Manager at Commission Shift, which is a statewide Texas organization working to reform oil and gas oversight by really addressing deficiencies in the Railroad Commission of Texas, the state's oil and gas agency. And so, I think a lot of us here have concerns about many aspects of how oil and gas is managed and the environment and the climate crisis and all of these things that we're working under. So I'm really loving the work that we're doing here. The values, and this is just sort of like a level setting, this is kind of where we're coming from in our organization, is that we really believe that Texas, we believe in global energy leadership and generational responsibility to past and future Texans. We believe in good government, which is kind of an audacious thing to say maybe, but most importantly, we believe in the people of Texas and, making sure that there's inclusive decision making across all of these so that community voices are heard. The work that we do is really on fixing the commission and ethics and language access and transparency around changing the name, but also in actually, cleaning up oil and gas operations. And I work on CCUS, carbon capture, use, and storage, which really sort of crosses over our orphan well program, our, waste beds, venting and flaring, all of the things. And so if you haven't had a chance to look through our website and check out all the wonderful programs and different reports and things that we're working on, please go surf on over to commissionshift.org. Just a little bit of a background. Here's the landscape of CCUS projects and sort of emitters and aquifers and oil and gas development zones in the state of Texas. And so this is a really good snapshot of kind of where current activity is happening. You can see there in West Texas, all the orange dots are active CO2 injection wells. And then along the coast, of course, you have, a few wells, injection wells, you've got pipeline and a lot of emitters, right? And so it's mostly this idea is that it's possible to transport the carbon from here to there or there to here. So think pipelines across the state and that sort of thing. So this is the current, not even the future projected build out of CCUS and associated projects in the state. So we're talking about methane projects, hydrogen projects, ammonia projects, and methanol. Whenever you hear about that, just think this is actually a CCS project.
You want me to go to O'Reilly's? Or later?
Someone. This person, I don't know who it is. Good job. Okay, and that's that for me. So with that, I wanted to pass it over to Becky and Lynn from Clean Water Action. I'm so excited to have them join us today for this deep dive series going in on water and water risks. So without further ado, I'll let you introduce yourselves. Thank you so much.
Good, still late morning here in the Central Time Zone. Is my sound okay?
Yep.
Great. I'm Becky Smith. I'm our Texas Clean Water Action and Clean Water Fund State Director. I've been hanging out with this great organization in total close to 20 years, and feel like it's really a home for my environmental activism. I am located in Houston and do work statewide here, and then some work that transmits to the federal level. We'll hear a little bit more about that work from Lynn. I think that's all I got for now. Oh, and I already said my nearest body of water is Buffalo Bayou, and I like to go down there for walks, see the bats come out of the bridge, the Wall Street Bridge at dusk, and ride bikes sometimes.
And I'm Lynn Thorp. Hi, everyone. I'm with Clean Water Action and Clean Water Fund. Also, I am our National Campaigns Director, and our work at the federal level, which is what I oversee, is focused mostly on water pollution and drinking water, which is a lot of things. And oh gosh, almost 15 years ago, I found myself needing to understand many things relating to oil and gas operations and water, and that included the Safe Drinking Water Act's underground injection control program. And thus, I'm here today to talk to you particularly about that. And my nearest body of water is the Anacostia River. I'm in Maryland, 10 feet or so from the Washington, D.C. line, where our office is in D.C.
10 feet.
Oh.
Thanks. And any other intros?
Oh, Becky, we should say, I think what we'd like to do is we're going to be doing a little back and forth to learn more about the risk to water and all that. And I think we'd like to save questions till the
Yes.
end.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah. SJ,
Mostly I just wanted to say SJ is on here from Commission Shift, and you see her on camera. She's running a show, and wanted to make a chance to introduce yourself if you'd like to. So maybe not.
Maybe not.
There was a delay.
There you go.
Thanks everyone. And if you have tech problems or questions, let me know and I can try my best to help out, and I will moderate the chat. Thanks.
Great. Shall I dive in then, Lynn?
Let's go.
Okay, great. So we've heard a little bit already about Clean Water Action, just a tiny bit more history. As you can see, we're a national organization founded in the wake of helping pass the Clean Water Act in 1972. So a long history. We've been present in Texas since 1984. Clean Water Action is our 501c4 arm. Clean Water Fund is our 501c3. So of course we work both at the federal level, and then we're in 12 states currently. The state offices aren't chapters or affiliates. We're just one big organization. And it's been really great to work in a couple of different states with clean water, because we are able, as a membership organization, I didn't say that, we are a grassroots member-led group. And so in our different states and cities where we are, we can be really responsive and fairly nimble to what are concerns, threats, pollution sources, and also what our members are concerned about. So it's we look a little bit different sometimes in each state. Lynn said our federal work focuses on water pollution and drinking water, especially, of course, the Clean Water Act and then the Safe Drinking Water Act that followed in 1974. So you will hear us talking a lot about the Safe Drinking Water Act's Underground Injection Control Program, and that's called UIC. You might hear us say that a good bit, or SIDWA is the Safe Drinking Water Act. So let's see, that's one of the spaces where federal policy really, hits the rubber hits the road here in Texas, where our state agencies do a lot of the regulatory and enforcement pieces under those federal laws. So real quick, am I doing the UIC background here?
Sure.
Okay. So underground injection control. Look, somebody stuck it in the Safe Drinking Water Act. So here we are in oil and gas as clean water action. There are a lot of activities that have, well, it's where we inject stuff into the ground. I mean, not me so much that I know of, but oil and gas is just one of those. And so for a long time, decades, there were concerns about what happens when you inject stuff underground. Water contamination is just one of those. Other concerns are seismicity. For lay folks like me, that's earthquake activity, which we certainly see unfolding. So the program got inserted or put in 1974 in the Safe Drinking Water Act, and EPA began to set it up and create classes for different types of injection. So we'll be mostly talking today about Class 2 and some about Class 6 injection. Class 2 is for oil and gas activities. And at its beginning, it covered two things. One was injection for wastewater disposal from the oil and gas extraction activities. And then two, you'll hear us talking about enhanced recovery, or EOR sometimes, enhanced oil recovery. Now it's also used for gas. So that's the second type, enhanced recovery, where various substances are injected into a well to bring up more of the product. So maybe a well is not producing any or much anymore, and this is a way to get more product out of the ground. So there was a big debate when hydraulic fracturing or fracking started about whether that was considered an injection activity. And so to make it really simple, Congress just exempted fracking in 2005. So we're not even talking about that here. And then in the late 2000s, the Bush administration directed EPA to start work on a new class for geologic sequestration or storage of CO2. And that's where Class 6 got its start. So I asked Lynn Thorp, who works in our Washington, D.C. office on our federal campaigns, to join me because she has been working on this quite a bit longer and knows quite a lot about all of the states where we're working, and where this underground injection is a real concern for sources of water, and to both underground sources of water that are currently drinking water, could be drinking water, all the good connections. So I'm going to start with a couple of questions for Lynn. So number one, I'd like to hear what are your concerns about the underground injection control program and risks to underground sources of drinking water.
Cool, will do. And SJ, if you want, you can take that intro slide down, and there'll only be a couple more times where we'll use a slide for you all. We'll mostly not be PowerPointing you. Yeah, thanks, Becky. It's really nice to talk to all of you today. And I want to do one more acronym watch, since it's easier to speak all these things when you will hear me say UIC. Apologies, that does stand for the Underground Injection Control Program. So, well, one of our biggest concerns is that the UIC program, so that's only one thing about a piece of oil and gas activity, but it's an important one because it is in the Safe Drinking Water Act, and we work on drinking water in the Safe Drinking Water Act. So we care a lot about anything to do with drinking water. And the whole reason the program is in there is because the goal is to protect our underground sources of drinking water. And we're just not convinced that that's happening. One thing I like to tell people, and I found it shocking when I discovered it, is that in the 1974 Safe Drinking Water Act, the first version of the Safe Drinking Water Act, where the UIC program was created, there's this language, and it says, in the little, it lists all the different kinds of injection, and it's talking about the oil and gas ones, and it says, the goal of the UIC program is to protect underground sources of drinking water, as long as it doesn't interfere or impede oil and gas activities. That's astonishing to me. Like, well, we've got this whole law and this whole program we're setting up, and we're going to protect that drinking water as long as it doesn't do too much, interfering with the oil and gas. It's crazy. And it doesn't say that about the other kinds of injection. It's really weird. And, as you might suspect, when the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, went to develop all the programs and and the regulations and the requirements, that posed a challenge for them. Well, how do I know whether I'm impeding or not? And we think that that really has led to this pattern of loopholes and exemptions and exceptions and lack of transparency. There's a root problem there. A few years later, in 1980, Congress decided to step in again and make some changes. And one of the things they did was, EPA had developed all these requirements for state agencies, usually oil and gas agencies, that were going to be in charge of the permits for this new UIC Class 2. And it had all these specific requirements. We have some concerns that they need modernizing and revising, but they were requirements. Oh, well, states didn't really want to have to follow those completely. So Congress said that states could get primacy through a new process that was for regulatory flexibility. So their program didn't have to look exactly like what the federal guidelines and requirements were, as long as it kind of accomplished the same goal. We don't have that in other federal things. Like if you're a drinking water regulator and you're supposed to make sure all the water systems follow the new limits for arsenic in drinking water, you don't get to say, I'll just make up my own and tell you it's close, right? That's not how anything else works. So you'll hear sometimes about different types of primacy, which really just means authority to run the federal program. That's why it's a big deal here in Class 2. It's very dorky once you start talking about it, but we think important. The other thing about the program that's concerned us for a long time is really since the 1990s, there's been very little money going into all the state agencies to help who run this program, to help them run the program. It's floated between like 11 to 13 million dollars for the entire UIC program for all the classes in every state. And yes, your railroad commission has other funding it can put in, and the state has funding, and there's some funding from fees and stuff. But really, that's absurd, when you think about what we need to do, how many people and what kind of effort and record keeping it takes to carry out the requirements to protect underground sources of drinking water. We also think the program is out of date for lots and lots and lots of reasons. Let me just tell you a couple of them, a few of them. Climate change and has stressed water resources in new ways. We might need to use water that we didn't think we needed to use before. So what, we might say, well, something wasn't considered ever to be likely to be a source of drinking water 30 years ago. It might now, and our ability to treat water has changed. So water that's really salty used to be kind of ruled out. That might not be now. Also, our population has grown. And so we think about 44% of the US population relies on groundwater for their drinking water. That means more people needing the resource, and that makes it a very important resource. Now, that can be people served by a public water system that uses some or all groundwater, or people who have a private well they rely on. So we've recommended more review of the Class 2 program and modernization for years. And in our resources that will get shared with you after the webinar, there's a few PowerPoint slides that include links to some of our reports. And one of them is a 6-page overview of the UIC program, Class 2, if you want to learn a little more and find other ways to research it. We also have a report we'll share from 2021 where we put all of our recommendations in one place around all the ways the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act and impact water when it comes to oil and gas operations.
So I guess my next question then is, have there been any review or updates?
Well, not what we've wanted, but I will say, like, we were really interested back in, I think it was in 2014 and 2016, when two really important federal reports came out from this thing called the Government Accountability Office. That's in DC, we call it the GAO. And the thing that's important about the GAO is that they do research and reports for Congress, but these reports and research can be useful to people like us and heads, federal agency people, and also for the general public. But they're requested by like congressional committees, or sometimes they're put right into a bill. And they can be really important in guiding federal government's work. And so the fact that there were two reports on the UIC program itself, as it pertains to oil and gas, showed that there was concern by members of Congress. And we had something to do with some of that. For example, in July of 2014, there was one called, and the titles really tell you the story, Drinking Water. EPA program to protect underground sources from injection of fluids associated with oil and gas production needs improvement. We would agree with that, and that one outlined all kinds of things that were of a concern, including like in the disposal wells, the overpressurization, although that can happen in the enhanced recovery wells too. And that can lead to things like the earthquakes we mentioned, or to leaks and blowouts where the well breaks, and therefore contaminants can get into the ground and into nearby water sources. They also talked about how EPA's oversight of the program and enforcement was not adequate, and that the regulations were probably out of date. And then again, in 2 years, GAO followed up with another study saying that the title said EPA needs to collect information and consistently conduct activities to protect underground sources of drinking water. Again, they dug in deeper into how, for example, EPA is supposed to be doing annual reviews of the states, theoretically coming and looking at the Railroad Commission, for example, and saying, are you doing everything you need to be doing to run this program? And they just weren't. There wasn't even like a workforce analysis. EPA didn't have much idea of who in the state agencies was, how many staff were working to implement the program. Was it enough to do what they were supposed to do? So, but I have to say, like GAO reports and other kinds of research concerned by policymakers hasn't led at the federal level to the kind of modernization and changes we'd like to see. There have been some examples of getting some issues elevated to the point where EPA took on some new work, if not requirements. Oh, SJ, if you could show that slide too, just for a minute here. I'll give an example of that. So sometimes you can affect change even if you haven't been able to get a regulation changed yet. Yeah, see that map there is a map of a thing called aquifer exemptions. We'll talk a little more about that, but when EPA went to set up the UIC program in the late 70s, into the early 80s, they realized that to be able to permit things that might threaten underground sources of drinking water, but not interfere too much in those oil and gas activities, remember, we had a problem, because for enhanced recovery, when you're shooting stuff down into the well to try to bring up more, you are potentially going through an aquifer, through an underground source of drinking water, or you might be near it. I mean, it does depend on the geology and everything, but so they created a thing called aquifer exemptions, which is what it sounds like. You're kind of exempting potential underground water from the concerns of the program, which basically say you can't inject into a drinking water source. But you're saying, well, I accept when you can. And one of those places is a lot of EOR activity, enhanced recovery activity, and the disposal wells. And so this map is dated now. It's old. It's from a report we did in 2015, and just mainly here to give you an idea of the parts of the country. I will tell you that a lot of concerns raised by not only our work, but our work in California, some in Texas, and at the federal level led EPA and states to undertake a whole bunch of activity to look at aquifer exemptions, and they have updated their maps. They are continuing to try to figure out how many they are, and you'll see in your resources some of our reports on things that really need to be done about this. It's a problem that every now and then raises its head in the consciousness of activists and policymakers and regulators, and then it kind of fades back. Just one more example of this map showed about 1,100-ish, if I recall, aquifer exemptions, which is what the federal EPA thought there were. And now we know there are at least like 5,500. And the record keeping, everything about the program has been a little shoddy, but we have been able to inspire some improvement, more needed. So SJ, you can take that down if you want. And just wanted people to get an idea of that. Yeah.
And I wanted to back up and just say for folks located, well, wherever you are, I will say that the city of Houston's main drinking water system serves about 2.2 million customers. And just looking at the sort of online available, what we call consumer confidence reports, which is just a water quality report, about 13% of that mix of water is groundwater for Houston's main system. And then most of our, even just the nearby suburbs of Houston are 100% groundwater. So just to give you an idea, this isn't just stuff that happens way out, outside urban spots, by the way. And then I did want to ask you, Lynn, I think I also saw some research that you mentioned by one of my former state director here, David Foster, had sent in a Freedom of Information Act request to the Railroad Commission, and the response came back, tell me if this is right, that they had never had anybody apply for an aquifer exemption.
Yeah, and I think we can talk about that a little more later too. But yeah, there was a whole lot of activity in around 2014, 15, 16 around aquifer exemptions around the country, like I mentioned, because EPA had elevated the issue, and a bunch of states were, having FOIAs from people like us and lots of inquiries from EPA. And yet first, Texas said no one had ever applied. The reason is complicated, you all, but what had happened is when the program first started, Texas seems to have pretty much grandfathered everyone in who was already doing like disposal wells or enhanced recovery. And then for a little while, it seemed as if no further applications ever came out. Now, there were a bunch of things happened after that, and it turned out that wasn't exactly right. Oh, well, they kind of grant them without the application and that kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, that's just how insane the record keeping and understanding of the program has been, Becky.
Yeah, so as we're honing in on Texas here, what does this mean for Texans and the risks what are we talking about, risks to our water here specifically?
Yeah, so from the things that the UIC program covers, so we'll just, there are lots of other risks from oil and gas, but so EPA has these state inventories and that they actually use it to help dole out that pittance of federal funding to help the states run these programs. And the latest I could get were 2022 numbers. But it showed that in Texas, you've got like 13,500-ish wastewater disposal wells. So that's again, you're injecting wastewater from oil and gas drilling into the ground to just keep it there. So say about 13,000-ish. And in 2022, about 37,851 production wells. So those are going to be all enhanced recovery. These days, that's mostly oil, although they're, it's been used in gas as well over the decades. To put that up against the whole country, EPA says there's about 180,000 class 2 wells, both kinds, all over the whole country. And they say that most of those are in Texas, California, Oklahoma, and Kansas. So you're probably not number one, but you're probably number 2 or 3. Oklahoma has a lot of the disposal wells. California had at least a lot of the production wells. What are those again? Well, so I mentioned just, the things we worry about in disposal wells, that high pressure, where you've had earthquake activity. Oklahoma in particular has had a problem with that, but it can also lead to blowouts and leaks, and that puts contamination into the ground, or directly into an aquifer possibly. What are you worried about with enhanced recovery? I mean, a whole lot of things, and you'll see in your resources a report about that. We'll talk about that a little more later, but it's had so little attention, even though it involves shooting all kinds of things into the well, chemicals and steam and water, and again, the same risks of potential contamination. There's also this not a new thing, but a developing thing over time and growing quickly, which is you've got enhanced recovery wells, right? So you're trying to shoot something down to make more oil come up, for example. And what you're shooting down is CO2, carbon dioxide, and you're calling it storage. So when Paige mentioned we have storage in a few places, that's the thing. It's not, this is an idea of storing CO2 and achieving some of our climate protection goals while we're bringing up more oil. We'll talk more about that too. And you've got a lot of that in Texas. And then the other thing, of course, that you all are really aware of, because you're debating now, not only the whole idea of storing carbon in a geological formation like a salt cavern or whatever, and it's got nothing to do with producing oil and gas. This is like a storage unit, only it's in the ground, and that's your class 6 wells. Again, we'll talk more about that, but that's on the table in Texas right now, because you're debating whether the Railroad Commission should be the permitting agency, have the primacy or authority to do that. And UIC, just so you know, SJ, if you could pop that slide up again, the whole idea of these underground injection control class 2 permits is that they're trying to protect drinking water by doing stuff we don't do for regular production wells, like just an old-fashioned oil and gas well. Now, maybe we should, by the way, but that's another webinar. But we're saying that because we're injecting stuff, we have a particular concern. And so there's all this, investigation you have to do to grant the permit. You have this area of review where you're looking way out at all the potential drinking water sources underground that might be impacted, and other kinds of geological things that might make the well risky. You're trying to figure out, how you might disrupt or contaminate the aquifer. You can see in this graphic of the well that, enhanced recovery wells and production wells too sometimes are going down below the aquifer, below the source of drinking water. So you want to be trying to figure out what are the pathways of contamination, and then what are all the rules that the well operator has to follow to avoid disrupting the drinking water source. And so, you want to take that seriously, because you're saying we can't just have a regular old permit here. We need a special attention. And in Texas, it's, it's come to a head with a lot of concerns about whether your state agency is accomplishing those jobs. So there's all kinds of other stuff about like mechanical and integrity, and the construction of the well, and what materials it has to be. And because it's in the Safe Drinking Water Act UIC program, you've got more public notification, you've got more requirements for public participation. But if these things aren't done right, then is it even accomplishing the purpose? So we can take that slide down if we want.
the sort of weakest link.
Yeah, like you're,
Yeah.
it, I think the UIC Class 2 program should be stronger and better. But I also know if you're not doing it right, you're not you're not even getting the benefit of what is in the requirements.
Mm. You may have covered this, but or just alluded to that during enhanced recovery, there can be lots of different kinds of substances being injected. Did you cover all of those that you think are of concern?
Yeah, and you all will see again when we'll send our slides to everyone who's here about, so you can see we did a report on enhanced recovery back in 2017 because we just couldn't believe nobody knew about it. And there was so much concern, and rightfully so, about hydraulic fracturing. I'm sure you all remember that. And yet enhanced recovery was really one of the predominant methods of extraction at this point in some parts of the country, and was growing in Texas, among other places. And we're shooting chemicals down in the ground, and we now know that there are PFAS chemicals in some of that that's getting shot under the ground. Because PFAS chemicals that you've all heard about, they make things smoother. It's very handy apparently. And so it can be chemicals, it can be steam, it can be water. There's one where they set
Did
stuff
you
on
tell me
fire.
you're about to say this?
Yeah. Yeah, there's one where they set stuff on fire. I mentioned earlier that the definition of enhanced recovery isn't entirely clear. And like there's this thing called fire flooding that I'm it's got something to do with putting something down into a well and setting it on fire. And then there's debate about whether is that injection or not. I'm sorry, I'm laughing, but you can see the things we deal with here. But even like when we did that report 6 years ago, almost 7, the 60% of oil production was happening in our country because of enhanced oil recovery. So
Wow.
and it's in the UIC program because we know it can put underground drinking water at risk. And there's just not a lot of good data, and we know there's some problems. That whole report, Becky, then led us to this carbon dioxide EOR, where we said, well, what is that? How come no one knows about this? And that was the idea that, like I mentioned, we can solve a climate problem by somehow collecting a bunch of CO2 and shooting it down there, and it brings up more gas, or oil, more often oil. But then it's for some reason we believe is really going to stay down there. And you can get a federal tax credit for this. We have a report on the 45Q tax credit. And so it's it's a kind of storage that some people think we really, really need to do because we need to store more carbon, and it'll help us learn how to capture the carbon. But it does beg a lot of questions when you're bringing up more fossil fuels to burn at the same time. And all the same other risks to drinking water still apply. And then, Becky, I will just say a little more. We learned too that this carbon dioxide's enhanced recovery actually uses more water than the regular enhanced recovery. And you all know how oil and gas extraction just uses a lot of water in general. And that's just crazy at a time, like we mentioned, where water resources are already stretched. And there's going to be all kinds of contaminants and other junk in there. It's just, we're concerned about all the same things with CO2 ER, on top of wondering why in the world is this such a great idea. So
so you said something about, well, I mean, I'm just hearing that this is like a potential double dipping scenario here, right? Where the CO2 is injected, you bring up more oil or gas. We don't know if the CO2 is staying in, but someone's getting a tax credit for calling that sequestration.
Indeed they are, yes.
So maybe this is a good time to just delve a little more into the difference in the class 2 and the class 6 wells, since it sounds like this is a whole class that's supposed to be just for that. Say a little more about that.
It's really confusing, right? Because you're doing one kind of carbon sequestration over in class 2 to produce more oil, right? Or it could be gas, usually it's oil. But then, like I mentioned, so back in the mid 2000s, was when the George W. Bush administration suddenly decided that climate change could be talked about. And one of the very important things they were going to do is set up a brand new UIC class so we could capture carbon and store it underground, like it's like your storage unit, only it's in rock, or it's in like a salt cavern or something. So that's when class 6 got invented. And so that's a different kind of storage, and it's thought of as being on a much larger scale. I mean, you all know that that kind of storage is barely gotten started, but involves all kinds of ideas like we're going to capture all the CO2 in one place, and then we're going to somehow build enough pipelines to take it all to one geological formation where we can shove it down there and it'll stay down there. There's a lot, we're dubious about it. But the first I'll say the drinking water concerns are similar, right? In that you're worried about leaking and blowouts that could be nearby or impacting an aquifer or an underground source of drinking water. And even though it's CO2 that you've captured, it's going to be in like this fluid form, and there's going to be other contaminants in there almost certainly. Plus, you don't want anything just disrupting an aquifer. It doesn't have to be toxic to be a problem, right? And you all might know this, until recently, no states really wanted the primacy or the authority to do these, and they weren't really happening. And there's all kinds of things that have to happen for this to even be real. But recently, Louisiana got approved for primacy, and now your railroad commission has an application in, if I'm not mistaken. And and I mentioned funding before. I think one thing that's making this happen is that the Inflation Reduction Act that Congress passed a couple years ago authorized like a bunch of money, $48 million for states to get help setting up these programs. There's this idea that this is going to now start happening. I wanted to mention, Becky, we're dubious. I know we're dubious on the whole thing because there's just all kinds of things that are going to be problematic that aren't related to water. And Paige referred to some of those, but pipelines, just endless stuff. I do want to say that the class 6 regs were developed in the 2000s, and so that means they're almost 30 years newer than the UIC class 2 regulations. So they actually are better. They're a little more modernized. They've got more scrutiny around where are the potential drinking water sources and some of the operational stuff. That's not to say we think the whole idea is great, but it is one thing I want to mention is that I have sometimes advocated that we should look at whether class 6 regulations wouldn't be, maybe all of class 2 wells should really be more like the class 6 requirements. So leaving aside whether we really want to use class 6 for this whole new kind of storage, like I mentioned, I'm kind of skeptical of it all, but for the existing activity we're already doing with disposal and production, I'd like to see either a new class or something more like class 6, modernize and improve those if we're really serious about protecting drinking water. So on class 6 itself, you might say, well, do we think it could protect drinking water if we do start doing all this geological sequestration? Given everything we've seen on how we actually run these programs, it's not that encouraging. Yeah. So I guess my overall message on this stuff, because I know we want to get to questions and stuff, is that and talk more about Texas. But these aren't the only concerns about water and oil and gas operations. And I just want to mention that it's because it's a big complex subject. There's a whole bunch of stuff around how oil and gas makes contaminated wastewater, and there are Clean Water Act connections that can affect our surface water, rivers and and all. And there's questions about, geology, like earthquakes and subsidence, and there's questions about water use at this time where our
Mhm.
water is so stressed out. And I don't know, our overall thinking, having worked on UIC all this time, is that the reason it's important is that underground drinking water, all drinking water, is supposed to be one of our most precious resources. And, some of the oil and gas people will say, well, we can protect it at the state level. We don't need new federal rules or federal programs. And it's just not the way it's worked. All of our environmental and public health laws are based on the finding that you can't do things state by state. It just doesn't work. And of course, having strong federal requirements means the states have to do a good job. And we don't think there's anything about oil and gas activity that makes it less risky to public health or to the environment. Like, we think sometimes it's more risky. And so this idea that they enjoy all these loopholes and exceptions and exemptions is ridiculous. And if we're serious about putting drinking water first and drinking water being so important, we can do better. So I'm going to turn it back over to you, Texans.
Thanks, Lynn. We wanted to invite Paige and any other staff folks from Commission Shift to sort of bring this back to, our local Texas concerns and what activities are here. And I'll say, I think SJ has already dropped the link for the petition that individuals can sign about Class 6 wells, and I'll let Paige get to that more. But just want to make sure I've said Clean Water Action is part of the coalition alongside Commission Shift and lots of other groups who are focusing some efforts around this primacy question. So that said, Paige, why don't you hop in and bring us home a little?
Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry, I just lost my connection a little bit. My thing is unstable. I'm just gonna go back to the slideshow a little bit so I can get to the end, because we have a QR code for that petition. Let's see. If I can share my screen. Oh, there's an even better one of the enhanced recovery operations. I like how it looks like a vintage, like hand drawn or whatever. It reminds me of those like Channel 8, it's PBS cartoons. Okay.
Yeah, right.
So there's the reports that we'll be sending around after this, and so they're clickable, and you can go, read them all at your heart's content as long as you want. And there's the contact information for Becky and Lynn, which we'll pass around. And then here is the information for our Class 6 primacy petition. So we just launched this a couple of months ago. We haven't really started pushing it a lot, but our goal is to get a couple thousand, maybe several thousand signatures, by next year, because this process is going to be the primacy application and public input process is going to be going on probably through 2025, maybe not through the whole year, but we're going to see things ramp up as the next legislative session comes around next spring, and things kind of get approved. So we're really trying to educate folks and start talking about and demystifying carbon storage and carbon injection in Class 2 and Class 6 and what we're talking about now, so that when we get to 2025, we have a bunch of educated folks who feel confident to go and speak out. So please share this petition with everyone you know. Email us if you want more information. But yeah, I don't necessarily have any questions. I think that was a great overview. Thank you, Lynn, so much for sharing all of that. Some people say that I'm an expert at this already, but I don't have the knowledge and breadth of water experience and all of that knowledge. So I appreciate y'all coming to talk about that. Was there anything else that we wanted to cover? Were there any questions from the chat or anyone who wanted to maybe, I don't have any, were there closing words maybe from SJ? I'll just give it a few seconds, but it looks like we don't have anything.
yeah, anybody with questions about any of these details, if you want to put it in the chat, we're happy to take a crack at answering.
While people are thinking of their questions, I have a quick one for Lynn and Becky. I was really interested in your slide about the aquifer exemptions. And so I was wondering, are there other kinds of exemptions for bodies of water? And do we know, how that has played out in Texas, or if that is also something we should be concerned about in Texas is water exemptions beyond just aquifers?
Yeah. Not exactly in the way, I think aquifer exemptions are unique, right? Because they basically, and you can see in our aquifer exemption report, we tell a little bit of the story where to meet the statute, the Safe Drinking Water Act language that says protect water, we had to actually say, no, we won't, or else we couldn't let the activity happen at all, right? So I think it's unique. There are some similar things, not even similar. There's something that might seem similar in the Clean Water Act, and where the Clean Water Act, which is our nation's water pollution law. So, Safe Drinking Water Act's about what comes out of the tap only from regulated water systems, right? The Clean Water Act's about trying to stop pollution into our rivers, lakes, and streams. And it says no oil and gas wastewater can go into waters of the United States. So your river or your lake or your stream. No, no, no. Oh, except if you're in the arid part of the United States. And I didn't prepare for this, so I'm not prepared to tell you where that starts. It's a longitudinal
Is it
definition.
the 48th parallel?
Yeah, and it's in Texas, if I'm not mistaken, runs right through your state. So on the western side, because they're more strained for water, oh, well, you can do some things that involve oil and gas wastewater finding its way into water. So it's not quite the same because it's not an exemption and it's not quite so broad, but I guess some people would say it's related. And we have a report on that too, but that's a whole other.
Gordon, we were talking about that in another conversation earlier this week about what are the loopholes, right? This sort of like aquifer exemption thing seems huge. I just, kind of found out about it recently and I'm like, what? And there's more. This isn't the only one. I mean, very clearly it's like they just roll right out of the stack. They're nonstop. And so what's the point of regulation if we're going to exempt all of these things? And I don't want to get into a big philosophical, discussion on that, but it would be nice to be like, here's all the exemptions, because I don't think everybody understands. I certainly
I don't know, you all might know this. There are exemptions for oil and gas that are pretty special to them in most of our federal environmental laws. And they're in the wake of the concerns some time ago about hydraulic fracturing, there was a pack of federal bills, a group of federal bills we used to call the frack pack. But really, it wasn't just about hydraulic fracturing and all the things that means. It was about oil and gas and trying to close some of the loopholes they have in the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, Safe Drinking Water Act. We have a whole law about hazardous waste. Well, really all waste, called the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, which you all will hear lawyers and us regulatory geeks say RCRA. RCRA, that's what they mean. Yeah. And so oil and like some large pieces of oil and gas waste is also exempt there. It's just wild. I think it shows you the power of that industry that was just as big in the 1970s. And yes, there are concerns for the economy and so, I don't know, energy and national security. And I don't mean to dismiss those as if we don't understand those. We all do. It doesn't mean that we aren't able to do these activities in a way that protects people and the environment, I think. So.
Absolutely. I appreciate that perspective. I think it's something that, I've been saying for a long time, maybe even we at Commission Shift this sort of like reasonable, moderate middle of like, we can have all of the things, right? We're not trying to shut down oil and gas. We're not trying
Not
to like
yet.
say no electricity, you know,
No,
no automobiles. But like, let's just do it right. Let's be responsible and respectful of the full scope of consequences, right? Like this sort of triple bottom line accounting of people, places, and profits that really hasn't been done. And now we're getting into another thing of like, why are our models set up like this, that we don't have accountability? But, you know, luckily that's what policy is for. And we're going to keep pushing on this side, you know, to try and change things. But specifically this Class 6, you know, program doesn't need to come to the Railroad Commission of Texas. They're not ready for it. Class 2 program needs major overhaul, and we're pushing for that reform. And, you know, I appreciate what you all are doing here to try to protect our drinking water. I think this issue of desal and water scarcity and drought is huge. And it's something that I think about a lot. And so, I just want to end on like a fire up note. I'm like, let's keep working to save our water, because I know I drink a lot of water, like all day, every day. And I don't want that to be more expensive or an elitist thing, because there's this like water is life, you know, and energy is wealth. And so like, what happens when those things cross? Who gets the what? Are poor people going to suffer? Are they going to, obviously, we know environmental justice communities are going to experience the first and worst, strongest effects of climate crisis, including water scarcity, you know, and that can have a whole host of effects. So anyway, that's another chat for another webinar. I want to wrap up unless there are any other questions.
Now, there are some questions in the chat.
Oh, good.
Maybe SJ is ready with those, and I have some thoughts.
I was gonna flag, Naomi commented if you could talk more about the injection wells and plume migration. That's definitely here in the chat. I don't see a second question, so maybe we start there, and then if there's others, I'll try to catch those.
Just in general, I could say that, well, here's a little handy little graphic. With any kind of injection well, obviously, if for some reason there was a blowout or a leak, or somehow the material that had been injected down were to escape, it underground, depending where it comes out, it definitely can create a plume. And so that's why I mentioned that thing called area review, which is just like almost like geology and engineering combined, like where you're looking at where the activity could put the drinking water at risk. It's because even if the leak didn't happen in an aquifer, it could work its way through the ground in a plume, you know, to the aquifer. Or and of course the plumes behave differently depending on where they are. Are they in water? Are they in what kind of soil? What kind of rock? And then what's in them? So there's a lot in both the Class 2 and Class 6 regulations that's attempting to think about what kind of plumes you could have and where they could go and how to control them. Some of that is adequate, some probably is not.
Thank you so much.
I just wanted to add a little bit more about the plume, because I think there's this CO2 plume, which is like, you know, that's what we're watching in our area of review. They're like, oh, make sure the CO2 only migrates this far. And then after this time period, like there's a case study that DOE has been working on last few years, and they like to show, oh, the CO2 plume spread out, but then it contracted and it's fine. It's been stable. It's no problem. But there's this other plume of the pressure front, and the pressure plume that, like, because the CO2 is under such high pressure when it's injected, it, you know, basically wants to spread out and like equalize that pressure in the subsurface. And so like, that's why it spreads out, but then it displaces other things with its even much, much larger pressure plume. And so we'll get like brine displacement or like heavy minerals and things that like we're fine and stable and not contaminating underground sources of drinking water before. And now that you've injected this and you have not just your CO2 plume, but your other much larger pressure plume displacing those things, you're contaminating further away sources of drinking water that weren't previously forecast as at risk.
Yeah.
Lovely Rita is in the chat asking, isn't there another way to pull the oil and natural gas from the ground without harming our ground and water?
Thank you, Rita, for that. You know, when I first started working on this, we were in the middle of what they called the birth of unconventional oil and gas drilling, right? And it was the hydraulic fracturing and it turns out, you know, ER, enhanced recovery, hydraulic fracturing, lots of other, these unconventional methods are becoming more widespread because we got the easy stuff out, you know, the so-called conventional drilling that doesn't have to have a Safe Drinking Water Act permit or anything, the old school kind of drilling. By the way, I think it has problems too, and that's a whole other webinar, but we got a lot of what's there in our reserves of oil and gas through those methods, and that's why these newer and more risky methods became bigger. So it's, yes, it's possible, but it may be that we've kind of reached the place where we can't meet our current needs, you know, using the slightly less risky methods.
So Marta put something in the chat and said, you don't have to answer this, but I think that I had blocked off till 1 o'clock. We're not running over, are we, at this point? Okay. So I mean, I would invite just a couple of us who are presenters to consider responding here, because it is really high level was the point, and how do we make this relevant? And I'll tell you, in my 20 some years working with Clean Water Action, I cut my teeth knocking on doors. So it was you had 25 seconds to get somebody's attention, and you got to make it real and relevant. So I talk about a problem, a solution, and a strategy, and you know, you got to get it out there fast. And so I'll just start by saying, I also, again, we could do a whole webinar on this, but want to like kind of zoom way out from where we are now to let's think about, well, first of all, is the solution to climate change doing anything that's going to extend the life of fossil fuel use? And let's think about talking to people about, hey, you know, if you never gain the weight, you don't have to go on the diet and lose it. Like, let's not produce the CO2. We don't have to put it somewhere that could maybe be dangerous in a different way. There's so many technologies and bites at the apple to be taken. None of these solutions for climate change are going to be a single silver bullet. You know, we didn't get here one way and in one day, and we're not going to get out of here with a simple single stroke, right? It's going to take all the technologies, all of the efficiency practices, some of the human, you know, our sacrifices of comfort, maybe, you know, put on a sweater, Jimmy Carter moment. It's going to take all of that sort of nuanced, multiple approaches. And so when we can talk to folks, you know, about, hey, there's this thing and it's EOR, or sorry, it's, you know, carbon injection, working to build that context into your sort of short conversation about, think about what, you know, how do we get there? Or how can we not get ourselves to that endpoint as like the biggest part of the conversation, is one way that I try to think about it and talk to folks about it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think I'd like to add, I appreciate that, because I've definitely done my share of canvassing, and you're like, you know, this is an education moment and you get it concise, right? Like, what do I really need to say in 2 sentences? You know, and I think that this, like, well, it's a complex problem that was created over time and we need every tool in the toolbox. I hear this one a lot in defense of CCS, that we need to use every tool in the toolbox. And I would say, yes, but, right, we don't start with the broken and most expensive tools. There are better tools that are cheaper and easier to use that don't cost, you know, like, let's start with those. And we're investing a lot of money in what's already been proven to be a broken and very expensive tool that hasn't gotten any better in the last 50 years that they've been using it. So, you know, to say that this is our best shot and most important and effective investment in the climate crisis in this moment, I would have to argue that. But I'm also here, you know, we have to develop this. It takes time to develop it over time so we can scale up and reduce some of those costs of entry to, you know, no, we don't. We don't have to do that right now, right? Let's mitigate those easy to abate emissions. Let's do energy efficiency. Let's do nature-based green carbon removal solutions, right? And then move towards this. But I agree, you know, like if we put in good protections for drinking water on oil and gas drilling operations, it will most assuredly reduce volume of output, production volume, because they have to clean it up, they have to tighten ship. It's going to become more expensive to produce. So we're going to have less oil and gas produced, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It's not that we're never ever going to use that oil and gas later or get to it later, but we would have less of a glut on the market now. It actually drives the price up, which is good for oil and gas companies in the industry, right? Tighter protections, more money for the industry. And then instead of wasting our time on this CCS stuff, like, let's do that later. I don't know. I'll stop. I'll get off my soapbox.
I like the analogy about tools, Paige. Why would you go with your broken and most expensive tool first? I'm going to remember that. We also have a question about sort of logistics with these oil and gas wells or these class 6 wells. What kind of actions, maybe class 6 wells in particular, what kind of actions do you have in place when there is a blowout or storages fail?
It would be different if you're talking about geologic sequestration or production with CO2 storage, supposedly, or disposal wells. In the disposal wells and the things in class 2, while the regulations have a lot to do with preventing that, once there is such a blowout, that really is not a federal issue. It's more got to do with your own state's oil and gas rules, which are vast and go way, cover all kinds of things that the UIC program doesn't get into. And so the companies are required to take immediate actions of all kinds. They're like engineering things to block it, and then also things to tell the public, and then they have to pay, for ongoing cleanup or monitoring. Whether that's done well, I can't speak to. You can probably guess that bigger companies are better able to deal with those kinds of things that happen than perhaps small and medium ones are, because it's expensive. Sometimes I think they don't deal with it. And then in the geological sequestration, there's not much to go on yet. But again, the class 6 regs are meant to contain many provisions that would prevent this. There's a little bit in there about liability if there were to be a breach, but again, that will have be a lot more controlled by Texas state or another states rules. Yeah.
And this issue of liability at the state, I think, is really, really important. And we started seeing that come up at the last legislative session, and we'll see it again next time. But there is a CO2 an anthropogenic carbon dioxide trust fund at the state that's supposed to help pay for this program, monitoring and enforcement and remediation and all the things, if and when after the point that the companies are no longer liable. And at what point, after how many years after you're done with the well and you close it up, do they transfer responsibility to the state and the cost to the state, right? Yeah. That's part of the ongoing debate in the class 6 program. Is it 10 years? Is it 50 years? I think it should be 100 years, right? Why do we want the people of Texas to be on the hook to clean up the mess of an irresponsible operator, right? So this question of how long should companies be liable and what should be the financial assurance to make sure that these programs are well funded for long-term monitoring and enforcement and remediation I think is super important and kind of going under the radar, because as nuanced as this conversation has been, we had to understand UIC and this and that and the other thing. So there's not a lot of folks talking in this space. And this is really, I think the heart of the conversation of like, well, who's going to pay for it? Is it going to be us? Is it the taxpayer? Or because this is touted as a public good, right? Like this CO2 storage is going to save us from the climate crisis. And so that's why we should pay for it as the public. Whether or not that's true, I don't know.
Oh, sorry, Paige, I didn't mean to cut you off. I was just thinking about sort of some early work in my Texas years here was doing research about what amounts of what type of toxic chemicals were stored on industrial sites, of which we have a lot, also largely related to this very same industry here in Texas. And the point was to help understand what the threats and risks were to, say, neighboring schools and neighborhoods and humans, and also the workers. And what we often found was that, sure, there was something on paper that said emergency response plan. And on the ground, you talk to an emergency responder and they have no idea what's there. And then Baby Bush made it even harder, calling it a matter of national security to block a lot of access to those records of what's on site. Okay, another webinar for another day. But if we think about something new coming online, and yes, we have seen accidents with CO2 pipeline ruptures. People don't know they're there. Emergency responders didn't know what was coming out of the ground or the pipeline that broke, how to respond. And by the way, when there is a CO2 pipeline burst, it literally kind of sucks all the oxygen out of an area, and combustion engines, i.e. ambulances and fire trucks, can't run. They can't get anywhere, but they didn't know what they were going to anyway. So responses to accidents are going to vary, not only state to state, but really just any location to any other location, and especially according to or in accordance with what local folks know and what we're allowed to know about industrial processes around some of these things.
We have a new question in the chat. Scott says, University of Houston says that Texas and Louisiana have more storage than local CO2 production and should look elsewhere, look at importing CO2 into the Gulf. What are the costs of that? And Scott, if you want to come off mute to like clarify or anything, feel free to.
Yeah, it's as much as this seems unnecessary for the carbon dioxide emitters we have in Houston and in Louisiana. Like Louisiana, for its climate action plan, says we really only need 19 million megatons CO2 storage. That's one project, and we're seeing 40 projects proposed for Louisiana, 40 injection sites.
Yeah.
But then you know, since 2020, I think it's McConnell at University of Houston has been saying that, hey, the Gulf and Louisiana and Houston and the Texas, both the Gulf, Texas, and like the Midland, Dallas area, we've got way more storage capacity even than our local petrochemical industry. So have y'all heard about plans to import CO2 across the ocean?
That's the whole reason this is happening. And it's like I mentioned, from our national perspective, we're at least dubious, because this is the whole idea that somehow there'll be this magic network of pipes that will then bring CO2 from all over the country to like Louisiana or Texas or whatever. The cost there speaks for itself. But that commission shift, you of course know a lot more about the real. This is what people really think, right? I mean, that's what they want to permit.
Yeah, I definitely have heard about that. I've seen projections of pipelines that cross the state, I've seen wells. I mean, they're having a whole conference on offshore carbon dioxide storage at Rice in a couple of weeks. I'm thinking about signing up. Of course, it's $500 to get in because they only want, industry folks there. We can't let the community know what are the threats of this, right? I think, given that we're talking about threats to drinking water, storing offshore may not be the greatest threat to drinking water, but I have
No.
major concerns about, ocean ecosystems and coastal quality of life. I mean, irreversible damage to, a Gulf that's already struggling. So, I think it's a bad idea.
Exxon has leased 163 blocks of the
Yeah.
Gulf of Mexico, and BOEM says they can't, there's no rules for doing CO2 storage as of now, but like no one has leased that much of the Gulf of Mexico for anything ever. So it's a real, the press is scratching their heads why Exxon would lease almost 1 million acres of the ocean. Is it for enhanced oil recovery? Is it for storage? But as
Is it for their new wind turbine farm?
Well, what's interesting is that a lot of the wind power plants will have to cross some of these leases to produce, to get the power transmission into the Texas grid. And what's happening in Louisiana, at least the CCS leases are charging, they enter private contracts with the wind power developers where the wind power has to pay the carbon capture company at least for, passing through their lease. So at the very least, it might
That is an
be,
ironic check to write, isn't it?
well, I'm paranoid, but it's it does seem like the oil industry protecting themselves against a real solution to climate, which would be electrification and clean energy.
That brings to mind another possible webinar topic of like carbon credits, and people are always asking us like, what do you know about that? I'm like, oh, don't get me started. What a mess. But I just wanted to be mindful of our time. We're 8 minutes to the hour, and I like to end meetings earlier than the hour because we're people and we need to get off the screens. But I think this was awesome, and everybody in the chat also thought this was an excellent conversation and great info. And appreciate all of your input. Thank you for joining us, everyone.
Yeah.
We'll hope to see you next month at our next deep dive webinar. So
Go sign petitions. There's an action to take.
Yeah, thanks everyone for doing that. And we'll definitely share out this recording and the slides as well, along with links to take action and the invitation for our next webinar once we have the details set. Folks, in the meantime, I think we can hang back the guest speakers so that we can kind of debrief. And yeah, thanks again for everyone who took all the time to ask those great questions and join the conversation. It's been really nice. Thank you.